So welcome everybody. Today is the 24th of June. It's amazing how the weeks are flying by. The longest day of the year has just passed and we're now into, looking forward to Christmas, December, which is often what happens with the young children in our houses. So I'm delighted to welcome you all again today to our masterclass series on neurodiversity. My name is Fiona McNicholas. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist who works clinically within a child psychiatry service in a pediatric setting and also academically with UCD. And I'm delighted to be part of co-hosting these webinars on the neurodiversity to facilitate really an interchange of ideas and opening of a discussion about the whole concept of neurodiversity. It's an initiative that has been led by UCD, Dr. Bláthnaid Gavin and colleagues in UCD, along with NUI Maynooth and ADHD Ireland. And I'm delighted to be joined this evening by my co-panelists, Dawn and Ken, to help in our discussion. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Damian Milton. Damian is a lecturer in intellectual and developmental disabilities at the Tizard Centre in the University of Kent. Damian is also teaching on the MA in Education Autism programme at London South Bank University and has been for many years a consultant for the Transform Autism Educate project and a number of other projects and indeed research initiatives. Damian has his own personal link with neurodiversity and with autism, and I'm sure Damian will tell us a little bit about that in his presentation this evening. And we're delighted and honoured that he would spend time this evening to talk about a concept that he brought to attention very much and has written and spoken about this, and that is the concept of double empathy. Damian, thank you very much for your presentation. I look forward to hearing it. Now, Dawn, if we could bring up Damian's presentation on the screen. Damian, will you be sharing the slides, or Dawn, have you got those ahead of time?
I don't have them here. No, Damian, if you want to share your screen.
And you're on mute at the moment, Damian. If you want to unmute, we'll be able to help you with...
Okay, I'll just see if I can find them. I'm just finding the right slides. If you bear with me.
Don't worry. This is where I usually pass over to somebody like Ken, who's the expert in the IT. And unless I've got help, I usually struggle tremendously with it as well. While we're waiting for Damian to find his slide set, Damian has written an excellent article on double empathy, which I've read ahead of time, and I'm sure we'll put that link up so that others might be able to access it. UCD have also started a Neurodiversity Masterclass, which we're very excited about, and we've introduced a lot of concepts from that, and indeed from the whole neurodiversity I suppose, movement into our teaching within psychiatry and within medicine. And I guess we're hoping at UCD that we can have our university much more aware of what Damian's going to be talking about, you know, this double perception to facilitate learning and access for those with neurodiversity.
You'll see that?
Yes, that's great.
Yeah. Some of this may have been covered in my talk at the conference that was held earlier this year. However, I've added on some slides to this towards the end, so I'll concentrate a bit more on those when I go through. Because research in this area is ongoing, and more publications are coming out all the time, it seems. So it's really interesting to see the new developments and so on as well. So this quote here is one which I don't like at all, but it's not one of Hans Asperger's finer moments, as it were. However, this quote kind of set a precedent which we've been living with ever since. The autist is only himself and is not an active member of a greater organism which he is influenced by and which he influences constantly. And what he's alluding to here is that autistic people are somehow not fully members of society in the way other people are, somehow beyond being socialized into norms and values of society and so on. And you can see here the sort of early origins, as it were, of ideas such as theory of mind, deficit in empathy and so on, which have often been ascribed to autistic people. But this tradition has often left a great deal out in how it's described autistic people. And the theory of the double empathy problem goes back a very long way, and in many respects, the origins of it were from my own personal experience, growing up as an undiagnosed autistic person myself. My son was diagnosed in 2005 at the age of 2 and showed very clear early signs of an autistic development. He's now 18 and is as big as I am, and would be classed as having severe learning disabilities. This led on, though, to my own diagnosis in 2009 with Asperger's, as it was known then. And when I was younger, I knew of the difficulties I was facing in life, but didn't really have a name for it, or different psychiatrists, psychologists had their own pet theories, as it were. But none of them really captured what my experience was like. And it took a long time. I was diagnosed at the age of 36, so well into adulthood. But back in the 1990s, I was a sociology student trying to figure all of this out for myself, in this confusing world I was living in, my place in it. And I wrote rather jargonated academic speak back then, where I talked about the human spectrum of dispositional diversity and comments like this. But after my son was diagnosed, I came across the work of other autistic authors, such as Jim Sinclair and Claire Sainsbury, sorry. And I started to use the term the double empathy problem at a parent group that I was attending. And this was also in part around some of the work I'd been reading about theory of mind in a response to that. So as an autistic sociologist, as it were, I found these accounts to be somewhat lacking. But I didn't really start presenting on this topic at events and conferences until 2010. And I first published on the topic in 2012. I didn't quite know all of this work at the time, but knew of some of it when I started writing about the topic. But I was not alone in my way of thinking. There was also the Canadian, I think, philosopher Ian Hacking and his student Victoria McGee. And there was also Dr. Luke Bearden at Sheffield Hallam University, who was talking about cross-neurological theory of mind, as he called it. And Rachel Cohen-Rottenberg, who was an autistic blogger who talked about similar issues. And what we were all talking about was this empathy problems being a two-way issue. And in 2012, I was doing some work with the Autism Education Trust. And as part of this work, I was analysing data collected. And part of this data was on experiences of school from autistic young people through various methods. And these quotes here were from some more verbally articulate autistic young people about their school experience. 95% of people don't understand me. Friends are overwhelming. Adults never leave me alone. Most worryingly of all was adults don't stop bullying me. And these quotes were far more common than issues with not understanding the intentions of others. They showed quite a good level of social understanding and theory of mind. These quotes, though, the average age of these young people was 10 and a half. And this is quite young, one might say, or just going in towards puberty, to be coming out with comments such as this, and the social disjuncture from other people that's being reported is quite a lot more extreme than you might find from other 10-year-olds. And the double empathy problem basically suggests there's a case of mutual incomprehension going on, where the breakdown in interaction between autistic and non-autistic people is not solely located in the mind of the autistic person, but largely sees the issue as due to differing perspectives of those attempting to interact with one another. So it's the different cognitive, perceptual, experiential qualities of life that get embedded as one develops and grows older that can create quite different dispositions and views of the world, and that these can sometimes clash. So it's not just autistic, non-autistic people who can have a breakdown in communication and mutual understanding. This can happen between any two people trying to communicate with one another. It just adds that kind of extra factor in, because whatever the cognitive difference is in autistic development, this is going to have cascading effects on how one perceives the world and how one interacts with others, and how they perceive and interact with you, and so on. And often theory of autistic mind can often leave a great deal to be desired. And this I wrote really in response to especially strangers. So if you come across an autistic person for the first time, it might be quite difficult to understand where they're coming from and to empathize with them. A parent, say, who has 20 years experience of parenting a particular autistic person may have quite a good theory of autistic mind. But something I've found, even with close family members, is you might be able to understand and predict them well, but on an intuitive level, you might not emotionally connect so easily. So some family members, I intuitively kind of know what they're thinking and what they're going to do. Others, I have to kind of figure it out a bit more. But I think this goes in both directions between people. And that some people you connect with more easily, and some people you just don't for various reasons. And one influence on my work was that of Lynn Cameron, who was interested in social group interactions and empathy and apathy, antipathy, and also what she called dyspathy as a term. And this was to highlight how empathy is often blocked or resisted by people. So just a lack of empathic response. And such research supports earlier social psychological theories such as Henry Tajfeld's, which found that people felt increasing emotional connection to those deemed within social in-groups, whilst sometimes stereotyping outsiders. And this quote's from Lynn Cameron, which I think is quite interesting in the context of autistic people and different sensory filters and perceptions, potentially. If we were to be continually tuning into other people's emotions, we would be perpetually anxious or exhilarated and very quickly exhausted. We must therefore have very efficient inhibitory mechanisms that screen out most of the emotional empathy being carried out by our brains without us even noticing. So this brings into all sorts of cognitive issues, from inhibition, which has been linked theoretically to autism by some, to perception and screening out attention and where your attention's focused and where it isn't, and whether that's matched with others in social interaction or not. So it opens out all sorts of issues in social interaction. And I've also been influenced by the work of Dr. Dinah Murray and Dr. Wen Lawson, who are both autistic themselves, and looking at the use of attention and interest, as they call it, and seeing attention as a scarce resource and autistic people's use of this attention for differing reasons, perhaps working in differing ways. And I think there's interesting work in neuroscientific theory being linked to autism, from predictive coding theory to inactivist theory and so on. And people are starting to draw the links between these autistic phenomenological, if you like, lived experience theories with neuroscientific ones, matching them up, which I think is very interesting. And there's another influence on my work was the sociologist Harry Collins. And he was even influenced by the work of Alan Turing and the imitation game, which is well known. But Alan Turing also used the imitation game, interestingly, between different cultural groups or dispositions. So it was a kind of party game between how well men and women understood one another, an adapted version of the imitation game at the time. And Harry Collins and Rob Evans, his colleague, looked at understandings between cultural groups, and they actually studied quantum physicists, and they talked about various levels of expertise. And so not many people can be a quantum physicist and contribute to that body of knowledge. They talked about a level below that, which they called interactional expertise, which is to kind of talk the talk or understand the narrative without necessarily being a contributor to that body of knowledge. And they said this should be a standard for sociologists studying cultural groups and so on. So I thought this interactional expertise was often lacking in people working with autistic people and their perceptions of the world and so on. And it's questionable how much effort has been made by researchers and those designing practice models in understanding autistic subjectivity and so on. And the evidence base around the double empathy problem, since I was writing all of this stuff, has blossomed in the last 5 or so years. There's been the work of people, the group at the University of Nottingham, Elizabeth Shefford, Danny Roper and colleagues, and they investigated 5 years ago now non-autistic participants' ability to interpret behavioural reactions of autistic people. And they found that people were less able to guess what that person was experiencing if they were autistic rather than non-autistic, apart from if they were reacting to a joke, which was more a universal reaction, as it were. There's also been studies regarding the forming of first impressions. And if autistic people are perceived less favourably, then this could result in social exclusion and discrimination even. And Stagg et al. Found that non-autistic adults rated autistic children as less expressive and less attractive than non-autistic children based on very brief videos of them. Noah Sasson and colleagues carried out a number of studies which showed that non-autistic adults rated autistic adults and children less favourably on a wide variety of evaluative dimensions, as well as indicating reduced intentions to engage with them. And this further research by them examined the impact of providing a diagnostic label, though, saying these people are autistic. And this seemed to have a positive effect in reducing these negative evaluations. However, that was kind of limited data to base that on. There's also been studies of meta-perception. Sasson et al. Again looked at where participants were asked to estimate how they were thought, how they thought others would perceive them, so that meta-perception, how others perceive me, kind of thing, on a wide range of traits. And they found that autistic participants were somewhat less accurate at this because they overestimated how positively they would be perceived by other people. In another study, Usher et al. Found that impressions formed between autistic and non-autistic people. They found in this study the autistic participants were more accurate in judging whether they would be liked or not by the person they knew. But this was with people they knew well. So when autistic people knew the other person well, they were quite accurate at meta-perception. They had more difficulties when they didn't know the person at all in the study before. And Brett Heisman and Alex Gillespie investigated these meta-perceptions between autistic people and their family members. And they found, again, the autistic person was in some ways more accurate at judging how their family members were seeing the situation, whilst the family members perceived breakdowns in understanding as largely due to the autistic person. And so things like theory of mind ideas in some way could be said to be harming family members' empathic reactions and understanding, because it puts the blame in the autistic person and their brain, as it were. So overall, these studies of meta-perception suggest that autistic people are quite good at estimating how specific others perceive them, like family members, but have some difficulty judging this more in general. And consistent with the double empathy problem, non-autistic people may have difficulty working out how they are perceived by autistic people and why. There's also been research around interactions between autistic people. This has often been noted that sometimes greater affinity is shown between autistic people and each other and so on. And this has been shown in the work of Catherine Crompton, who works at the University of Edinburgh in a number of studies. And these discussions around these studies are available on things like YouTube. We did a virtual symposium a couple of years back now, where a number of these researchers were talking about their studies. And then there's follow-up YouTube clips where I'm interviewed discussing each of the studies and what they found out. So if you want to look in further depth, there's some YouTube clips there. There's also been a range of interesting work spreading out in different academic disciplines. There's the autistic philosopher, Robert Chapman, who draws upon this area, and also people like designers who are trying to design more and make adjustments for autistic sensory needs, things like this, and they're drawing upon this work. And interestingly, as I said, neuroscientists are matching up some of their theories. And there was one in particular, the work of Dimitri Bollis and colleagues, and they came up with a theory which they called the dialectical misattunement hypothesis. And this was basically the double empathy problem, but framed from predictive coding neuroscientific theory and coming from a completely different direction and coming to pretty much the same conclusions. All of these links here are studies that have been published just in the last couple of years, ranging from utilizing interpretive methods as a way of trying to bridge the double empathy problem to the work of Gemma Williams, who's linking linguistic theory like relevance theory to social interactions between autistic people and each other and autistic, non-autistic and so on. There's also been recent work linking the double empathy problem and this breakdown in communication as leading to rather negative consequences in practice. So when trying to access healthcare or mental health care. So all those links, I can share my slides afterwards, but those are links to recent work. And just a couple of months ago, I think, there was the INSAR conference held in America, and it had to be held online this year. But a very big sort of research conference I'm sure many of you know about. And these were posters that were presented at INSAR this year, and both talk about nuances of the double empathy problem in more detail. There's the work of Kelly DeBranda and colleagues, part of Noah Sasson's team again. And this was about meta-perception and understanding social disinterest in conversation partners. There is also this poster at the top here from Yulin Chen and Christy Patton. And they did a social network analysis of autistic children in a kind of after school club, I think it was. And they showed that the autistic children started to network with each other more strongly, and the non-autistic children formed a kind of group. So there was a kind of two subcultures within. By putting the numbers more equally, you just had a somewhat linked but divided kind of community, which is very interesting kind of research to look at. And one needs to think of these social disjunctures and misinterpretations as well as being embedded in wider social power relations. And in this sense, I've drawn upon the work of the feminist writer Iris Marion Young. And if you think of notions such as ableism or mansplaining, there's a similar understanding here of a power-laden miscommunication and misunderstanding, but where power can make a negative difference. And taken for granted frames of reference can render the point of view of the marginalized other as invisible, as it were. So it's important to remember how these problems are situated in wider power relations and intersectional ones. And so in building up a knowledge-based communities of practice and so on, we need to avoid tokenism and seed power to be participatory in doing co-production and so on. And in practice as well, this means humility and building rapport and tacit knowledge between parties, as it were, and across disciplines and practices and so on. And reducing the imposition of social expectations. So one thing to do is to put one's assumptions aside, because you may be getting it badly wrong, especially with a person you've only just met, kind of thing. And it means collaboration in setting the research agenda, in design and development of strategies and methods. And this is why I champion participatory work in the field, and I'm chair of the PARC network. Another article to draw your attention to, this was one we co-wrote with Catherine Crompton, Brett Heisman, Noah Sasson, and myself, and Keely DeBranda. So all sort of five of us got together. And we wrote this about the evidence base and the theory around double empathy problem. But it was for the Frontiers for Young Minds journal. And so it was reviewed by children to be accessible, as it were. So the language used cuts out some of the jargon and phenomenologies and all of this kind of thing. And is a nice, practical, accessible guide, which many adults and practitioners have contacted us and said how useful it is. So a couple of quotes to conclude. This is from the seminal work of the early activist, Jim Sinclair. Grant me the dignity of meeting me on my own terms. Recognize that we're equally alien to each other, that my ways of being are not merely damaged versions of yours. Question your assumptions, define your terms, and work with me to build bridges between us. And this was from a magazine article from Asperger United some years ago, and a study I did on the content of it. When I'm in an environment I feel comfortable in, with people who are kind and tolerant, and doing things I enjoy, then I'm as happy as the next person. It is when people tell me I should think, speak, or behave differently that I start to feel different, upset, isolated, and worthless. So surely the problem is a lack of fit with the environment, rather than something inside my brain that needs to be fixed. So lots and lots of references there. Sharing. You can see there's a couple of questions and comments and things.
Damian, thank you very much for the presentation. That was very, very enjoyable. Maybe I could start by asking a few general questions. You mentioned the fact that autistic individuals may be seen less favorably than non-autistic individuals. And this also applies, we find it in work with looking at children with ADHD, where they're also perceived less favorably, people not wanting to socialize with them, and indeed in other disorders that are examined, both physical and mental health disorders. But you mentioned that diagnostic labeling, when the individual was given that information in the research studies, it led to a more positive impression of the individual and more of a wish to engage. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about diagnostic labeling and some of the positive things, both from the research and perhaps you mentioned yourself, you know, that it took you some time. You had gone to different people and it was quite late in your you know, sort of your career in adult life that you yourself received a diagnosis. Could you talk a little bit maybe about the benefits, as you see it, of diagnostic labeling?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag in some respects, but the positives can often outweigh the negatives for various reasons. If I start with what the research found with Noah Sasson and colleagues, they found that by giving people this information, they were on paper less judgmental in questionnaires and so on. Whether that translated into practice is another thing. And you also have issues of pity with disabled people. So the kind of stigma can shift from one form to another. However, by providing some information, it does seem to reduce this first impression negativity that people might have to some extent, or it would be indicative of that, hopefully. In terms of benefits of diagnosis on a personal level, I would say in terms of understanding, I got more understanding from connecting with other autistic people and through community and meeting people in a way. But having a door into that, so if there wasn't a name for it, how would I have met those other people and understood there was this common factor to explore? There's also obviously trying to gain access to certain services or adjustments at work. And when I was undiagnosed, I had terrible kind of stigma and fallings out with managers at work, and my career was a lot going a lot worse than my academic qualifications, as it were. So gaining a diagnosis gave some way of exploring and self-understanding, but also how others were reacting to me and why. So it did, even though I was a sociologist for years trying to work all of this out, it did help that myself in that journey of understanding. But I think it goes way beyond just the diagnosis to a kind of interactive understanding, meeting others, being part of a community really helps. And this is often lacking, I think, in post-diagnostic support. So for myself, I didn't have any specific service needs in terms of health. I wasn't learning disabled, I didn't have mental health needs at the time, but I had been made redundant from work when I was diagnosed and was not in the greatest housing situation. So I could have done with some social support of some kind at the time, or some counselling around work or something like that, perhaps. But I would have probably rejected a lot of it as not understanding my needs again. So a lot of people can be quite capable but end up in a negative spiral socially, and then that can lead on to mental health issues and crisis and so on. And so having a diagnosis, I think, and declaring that has certainly helped me in work situations. But then my academic career started to go towards autism as a specialism. And so many of the people I've worked with for the last 10 years have had some understanding of my needs through the work they're doing. So it's, and you feel more confident about claiming adjustments and needs because they should have this understanding. They're working in the field of autism. Do you see what I mean? So would I have been so successful if that wasn't the case? I don't know. And there are disadvantages, I guess, where some people who may treat you by that label first, so they might think you're not capable or you'll need things explaining very simply, and make assumptions again. So what's really needed is to get to know each individual and their personal needs and so on, and that takes time. So, but if you're not diagnosed, you're still stigmatized, but in some ways the stigma is far worse, because teachers might think you're lazy, or as some teachers described me as a child, you may have people trying to understand what's happening, but using very different sort of ideologies to try and explain it, and making things much worse for someone. So I do think diagnosis has many uses. I think it could be better, and the whole process would be better. But I think it's obviously has benefits for people.
I'm aware, Damian, from the neurodiversity movement, that there's a certain concern about diagnostic labels also, in that they may marginalize, stigmatize, they may assume that there's an inherent disability or disordered development linked with various diagnoses.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing that you mentioned is that, maybe you had seen different people and it was a delayed recognition in your case. And within clinical services, where somebody comes to a clinician's attention driven by a sense of they're struggling in some area, and sometimes it's a parent bringing a child, and sometimes it's a young person themselves or an adult if you're running, working in adult services. And I guess what I'm mindful of is, as you said, the ideology of the clinician, or indeed, you know, the professional group, as to whether, you know, they see something, whether they're searching to try and put something into some sort of framework that might then give an understanding, whether to the person themselves, or if you're talking about this double empathy, maybe to themselves by way of interacting, to a parent by way of interacting with
Yeah,
the child.
I think it needs quite a skilled clinician really to do a good job of it, and some of that interactional expertise, because it can be quite difficult to know how someone's going to take this news. And the way it's often framed, it causes some of the stigma. So some of the medical terminology can be quite damaging, I think. So disorder, deficit, dysfunction. Do you see what I mean? These terms, challenging behavior and so on, it can position someone in a very negative light. And people can internalize these descriptions of themselves, see themselves as a burden to others, which is a real problem mental health-wise. And so what neurodiversity brings, I think, is a more neutral perspective, which acknowledges the issues, difficulties. We know it's a very difficult life sometimes being autistic. We're not going to minimize that at all. But it's also to celebrate our achievements, our strengths, our persistence. Like I heard recently, the new world's strongest man is an autistic guy with an autistic coach. And that's autistic persistence for you. And drive. And
Yes.
I think that there's stories like that all over as well. And I know it's incredibly difficult. I mean, my son has very high support needs. I'm not going to say this is a bed of roses in any way. But you can certainly make life better for my son by having this greater understanding and making adjustments around him so he's getting more out of life and not continuously distressed by other people. So
there is a question, Damian, by one of our attendees, Sue Langdon, who asked just that, whereas, you know, the onus is so much on the autistic individual to fit in. And in fact, as you said, some of the difficulties, like that person who's the world weight champion, the persistence leads to successful outcomes in different scenarios. So what can be done to allow organizations or institutions or individuals to meet the person in the middle in terms of making adjustments to their own social behaviors or expectations?
I think an awful lot can be done in this way. I'm a bit idealist perhaps, but to me, autistic people are putting in huge amounts of effort all the time to navigate the social world. And if people gave half that effort back, it would make a huge difference. And it's about rapport building, relationship building over time, that tacit knowledge that can be built from that. And I think having a different focus on what you're trying to achieve with people. So often there's a focus on remediating autistic symptoms and difficulties, which ends up as an attempt to normalize in a way and mask your difficulties and disabilities. And largely doesn't work very well, or burns people out through the effort of trying. And what I've found often works best for autistic people is letting us be autistic, but doing it our way well and supporting that. So becoming specialists in our interests. The only way I've ever found work of any fulfillment is through my interests and pursuing them further, not holding them back on them. If I was to rely on the things I'm not so good at, like practical skills, admin, managing other people in busy environments, if I was trying to wear a suit and a tie all the time and look a certain way, I'd fail at it. And so I need to work and make it successful my way, which is really hard and takes a very long time. And I recognize how hard that is for young autistic people. I think young adults and that intersection with work is really tough. But then things like work placements, apprenticeships, where people learn on the job, can show what they're capable of in practice. Jobs that are better matched to individual needs, it can be done. And I know there's lots of efforts and groups working in employment and trying to improve things in that area.
There's always, Damian, going to be that tension between, you know, whether it's a organization, you know, meeting their financial objectives or their outputs, or whether it's a school, a mainstream school setting where one teacher is trying to teach increasingly large numbers of children. And of course, as you say, allowing the individual to work or learn to their best abilities, which might be, you know, very, very frequent breaks or a lot of multimodal ways of learning or time out or learning different ways. How realistic is it, do you think, that that is possible to put in both mainstream schools, universities, and mainstream, if there ever was a mainstream, employment? Or, you know, is
yeah, it's in some ways it's easier than people think it is, but it's difficult because of people's willingness to put it in action, or the structures and pressures various workplaces and environments are under. And so I have a great deal of sympathy for a teacher who has a class with 30 plus children and needs to teach a very wide range of needs, backgrounds, strengths and difficulties. I wouldn't be able to do it. So I have a lot of sympathy for these teachers who are in this situation. In an ideal world, I would have smaller schools with smaller classes, more of them, a lot more investment in education. But then that is kind of pipe dreams at times. But then I've also seen, so when I was working in the Transform Autism Education project, I was working in Athens in Greece with a full-on economic crisis that Greece has been going through in recent years, where the headmaster had basically no budget whatsoever left and had ripped jeans and a t-shirt on themselves, and they didn't know if the staff were going to be paid from one term to the next. And yet the dedication and passion to learn and to share ideas, to do their best with the children at special schools and things were probably more than I've drive and so on and staff I've seen in the UK, if one was to compare. So it's not all about money, although that helps. It's about culture and ethos, willingness to change, ability to. So one of the problems is the other pressures schools are under in the UK, targets to meet and so on. Yeah, I've seen good practice even in mainstream schools where you've had forward-thinking head teachers and Senkos and things like this, where they've put in a lot of measures and made a real difference. So you might be constrained by these structures, but you can still make the most out of the situation you're in. Having said that, I've also seen some schools where the leadership is not on side with these things, and some of the staff are, but they can't get the structural environmental changes needed to de-stress the children. And so you end up with a dysfunctional environment with stressed out staff, stressed out kids, stressed out parents, with the veneer that it's all working fine when it really isn't. So what I say is progress is always possible. So wherever you are, if you're in crisis or doing rather well, you can still improve. And always work to try and improve things. And it's that ethos that's really needed.
Is there any training on double empathy, the concept and the importance of both individuals, learning and modulating their behaviors, particularly, and there's a lot of questions about difficulties with employment and sustaining employment and misunderstandings. Is there any rollout of any training for employers? Be more accommodating?
Not that I know of employers. I mean, I've done some bespoke training for some employers in the past myself, but and I know there's a small group called Employment Autism that's doing work around this area. And I think that's an area which needs expanding around employment, training and so on. I think there are practice models and training around care services and so on, which are already pretty good. Things like the low arousal approach, Studio 3 group do some very good work. And have listened to some of these theories and built this into some of their training and so on. There's also, I've had some involvement with one of the pathways for the Oliver McGowan mandatory training that's being developed in the UK for health and social care staff, and some of the double empathy stuff is being used there, and in the Autism Education Trust materials. And so I think in autism training generally, these ideas are starting to filter through into various training packages. I think we're yet to get there somewhat in employment, but there have been some good initiatives in the past, and we need to pull on that evidence from the past and various initiatives and build towards the future, because there are some groups doing practical work dotted around the UK and Ireland, no doubt, by sharing their expertise and experience can really potentially build on things. And I think that community sharing as a general principle can go a long way. So one-stop shops in communities, community hubs with sources of information, meet-up points. It's this kind of thing which I think really strengthens everybody and has points of contact, advocacy support, you know, it's this kind of stuff which can really help make the difference.
Damian, may I just check with my panelists, Dawn and Ken, whether they'd like to offer, we're kind of running over time, and thank you and to all the attendees for that. But just to ask Ken and Dawn if they wanted to bring to the discussion any points that might be coming up on their chats, or anything they'd like to raise with you, Damian. Ken or Dawn?
Just very quickly, just for myself, you know, I'm a parent of a 24-year-old son with Asperger's, so I get an awful lot of what Damian is saying, and I appreciate him saying that. The big thing I took out of the talk tonight was just the one quote, and I did pop it into the chat, and it was let them be autistic and let them do it well. And if we can let them do that, I think we'll have solved an awful lot of the problems that have been discussed here tonight.
Easier said than done with wider society, I'm afraid, isn't it? That's the problem. But I think when you have these environments which are well suited and people can thrive and really show that. And yeah, there's difficult times in sort of young childhood, adolescence, young adulthood. There's crunch times along the way. But I think with given the right environment, people were more fulfilled, happier, pursuing interests, and this can lead to all sorts of achievements.
Again, just the other quick theme that came up, there was an awful lot of talk about employment. Now we're all familiar with the same employment figures that, you know, 70 to 90% of people with autism and Asperger's are unemployed and unfortunately remain unemployed.
Yeah, it's difficult getting accurate figures on it, but on those who are formally diagnosed and known to charity services and things, the employment figures are really poor. I think the only disability group with a poor outlook is learning disability. Yeah, it's not a good picture, and also this goes throughout the system. So after graduation, the group with the poorest prospects of employment after getting a degree are autistic graduates. Becoming also throughout, it's really hard just getting started in a career or a path into work. Getting a first job, just that foot in the door, as the saying goes. I think that, and then when you get there, is sustaining it without having problems in work with colleagues or work environments and so on. And there's a lot of unreasonable adjustments, which is better than nothing. But one of my issues, what I say about it, is reasonable to whom and adjusting from what. So it's the assumption is we're making a special effort to fit you in to the way we do things. We're not actually changing the way we do things too much on a universal level. So I like ideas around universal design and being more inclusive, and having these things often helps everybody as adjustments. So why not do it for everyone? Having clear instructions, isn't that just a good thing? This shouldn't be an adjustment, it should just be good practice. You know?
Well, thanks for that. Thanks, President. Yep. This is obviously I just hand back to the chair, Fiona. Just unmute there, Fiona.
Thanks, Ken. It was getting a little bit noisy. I'm sharing my office with some very, very dedicated medical students over the summer.
Still here.
And so they're beginning to close and get ready to go. Damian, thank you so much for that. We obviously have a huge ways to go, and I think it's work like your own and sharing personal experiences. And we didn't touch at all on it today, but maybe another time. That whole aspect of getting, as you say, the autistic perspective in research and considering the conflicts of research, you know, between funding going to associations and researchers, scientists conducting the research. And sometimes they've been very, very disparate from the individuals themselves, what they would like to be researched. So I think it's very important that, you know, as academics or even as clinicians, that we absolutely bear that in mind and wholeheartedly embrace, you know, that perspective of participatory engagement with individuals.
And I think when practitioners, clinicians, researchers do put that effort in, it's very much appreciated by the community. It makes a real difference, and people say they're allies, as it were, and recognised as such. And so some researchers have a great reputation in the autistic community because of the way they go about their work. And, that respect and mutuality is there throughout what they do. And so when that work is shown and authentically, people really do pick up on it and want to work with you. So bringing people together authentically is what's needed, because sometimes some interactions and organisations I feel have somewhat tokenistically used people or had their own agendas too much. But if it's a real genuine effort to mutually co-produce, as it were, and complement expertise, then that's when the difference really is palpable.
Thank you, Damian. Unfortunately, I will have to close the session. Thank all the attendees who have stayed on. I hope it has been helpful to you for whatever of the reasons that you have joined. Please feel free, obviously, to listen and go back and look at all the other masterclasses that we have had, videos. You will be able to access them. Our next class is on the 29th. Oh, hello. Hello. Damian, who's that? She looks lovely. A very quiet, well-behaved.
I've been invaded by my daughters.
Lovely, lovely. Delighted to see you. Oh, hello. So hopefully we'll be able to give her some special attention. So the 20th, we have Beth Radulski, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, on autism and neurodiversity advocacy. And that will be at the earlier time of 10 o'clock. So we look forward to as many of you that can join us then. And I wish you all a good weekend and a good month in between. Thank you, everybody. And Damian, thank you most sincerely.